He was humiliated and thrown out of a restaurant that once belonged to his family. Yet this injustice set off a chain of events that exposed prejudice and restored dignity. What happened next will surprise even the most seasoned observers. But let's start from the very beginning. The Paradise restaurant buzzed with activity during the evening rush hour. Eric, a young waiter with ambitions of becoming a manager, moved confidently between tables, catering to wealthy clients with an air of practiced politeness. His attention was drawn to a figure at the entrance, an elderly black man, dressed modestly, but with a posture that radiated dignity. The man approached the counter and politely requested a table by the window. Eric frowned. "I'm sorry, we're fully booked," he said curtly, giving the man a scrutinizing look. The man, maintaining his composure, softly clarified, "I only need coffee and dessert. Are you sure there isn't any space?" Eric glanced irritably around the room. 2 tables by the window were clearly unoccupied. "No, we can't seat you. Try the cafe across the street," he replied, his voice louder now, drawing the attention of some patrons. A few customers glanced toward the scene with mild concern, but none chose to intervene. The man sighed, nodded, and turned to leave. His cane tapped gently against the tiled floor as he exited the establishment. At the door, a waitress named Linda, who had been observing from the sidelines, stopped him. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly. "I don't think you deserve to be treated like that. Are you all right?" The man paused and looked at her with a faint smile. "Thank you, young lady. This isn't the first time I've been underestimated, and it may not be the last," he said before stepping out into the evening, leaving a faint murmur of discontent among the other guests. Eric returned to his duties, convincing himself that he had made the right decision. But within hours, that choice would come back to change his life. Linda couldn't forget the face of the elderly man leaving the restaurant with quiet dignity. Her journalistic instincts told her there was more to this story. After her shift, she grabbed her jacket and set out to find him. A few blocks away, she spotted him sitting on a bench in the park, gazing down a tree-lined pathway. "Excuse me," Linda said as she approached. "I saw how you were treated at the restaurant. It was unfair. May I ask you a few questions?" The man turned to her, his eyes reflecting both weariness and wisdom. "I'm used to situations like that," he replied calmly. "My name is Charles Walker." Linda sat beside him and pulled out her notebook. During their conversation, she learned that Charles was a decorated war veteran, honored for his bravery. After his service, he spent years working to rebuild his hometown, organizing aid programs for the poor and fellow veterans. "This restaurant used to belong to my family," he said unexpectedly. Linda froze. "Your family? But how?" "My father opened it back in the 1950s. After his death, I inherited the business, but hard times and pressure from the city forced me to hand over control to a partner," Charles explained. "Since then, I've watched everything we once took pride in disappear." Linda was stunned. "You need to tell this story," she urged. "People need to know who you are and what you've been through." Charles smiled faintly. "I've never sought attention. But perhaps you're right. Sometimes silence isn't the answer either." That night, Linda sat down at her laptop. She wrote an article about the unjust treatment of veterans, highlighting how prejudice can affect even the most honorable individuals. She included a mention of the Paradise restaurant and Eric, though they were only part of a larger narrative. Still, it was enough to spark a storm. Within hours, the article went viral on social media. People shared it widely, outraged by the injustice. By the next morning, Paradise Restaurant was at the center of a scandal, and Charles Walker's name was on everyone's lips. The morning after the article's publication, Paradise Restaurant became the epicenter of a scandal. Social media was ablaze with outrage. Thousands of comments called for a boycott of the establishment. Journalists flooded the restaurant with calls, demanding explanations, while the once busy doors now stood almost deserted. Eric, oblivious to the growing crisis, entered the restaurant and immediately noticed the tension among his colleagues. Eric! The manager snapped sharply. Have you seen the article? Do you realize what you've done? Eric stammered in confusion. What article? The manager, furiously jabbing a finger at his phone screen, thrust it toward Eric. On the screen was Linda's article, featuring a photo of Charles alongside the headline. War veteran and former restaurant owner, humiliated by prejudice. Where are our morals? Eric went pale. He recalled the man he had turned away and suddenly understood the gravity of his actions. I didn't know who he was, he began to explain. His words trailed off as the restaurant door swung open. Charles Walker entered, his posture firm and confident. Accompanying him was a lawyer, followed by several journalists with cameras. Eric froze, unsure how to react. The manager rushed toward Charles, attempting to appear welcoming. Good morning, Mr. Walker. How can we help you? He said, his voice trembling with nerves. Charles calmly pulled a folder of documents from his briefcase and laid it on the counter. I'm not here for apologies. I'm here for justice. This restaurant was built by my family, and I remain its co-owner. As of today, I'm taking back control. A tense silence filled the room. Eric tried to interject. I didn't know who you were. It was a mistake. Charles turned to him, his voice calm but resolute. You didn't need to know who I was. You needed to treat me with respect. You humiliated me not because you didn't know me, but because you decided I wasn't good enough for you. The manager suggested they discuss the matter in private, but Charles refused. Everything will be handled transparently, he declared. I will restore the atmosphere my father was proud of. This restaurant was a place where everyone felt welcome. I will make it that way again. News of the confrontation spread rapidly across social media and news outlets. Journalists captured Charles's statement, and customers began returning to support his vision. Eric was fired on the spot. The manager, realizing he had no control over the situation, reluctantly agreed to transfer leadership to Charles. Meanwhile, Linda watched the events unfold, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. Charles's story had become a powerful symbol of dignity and equality. Messages of gratitude and support poured in, with many calling him an example of courage and resilience. That evening, Charles closed the restaurant's doors to prepare for its reopening. Before leaving, he turned to Linda and said, "Thank you for giving me a voice. Sometimes it takes just one person to start a change." That day marked the beginning of a new chapter for Paradise. The restaurant was no longer just known for its fine dining, but also for its victory over prejudice. A week after the scandal, Paradise Restaurant reopened its doors under a new motto: Dignity for everyone. Charles personally greeted guests at the entrance, and the staff lineup had noticeably changed. Eric was no longer part of the team, replaced by employees who shared Charles' values. That evening, a special event was planned, a dinner honoring veterans and the local community. Seated at the tables were not just wealthy clients, but also everyday townspeople, whom Charles wanted to show that this was a place for everyone. Linda was among the guests, quietly observing how the story she had told was coming to life. Charles rose to deliver a speech, his voice strong and steady. This restaurant was founded by my father to be a place where everyone felt respected. Over time, it lost its soul. But today, we're bringing it back. Every person deserves respect, no matter who they are or where they come from. The room erupted in applause. Unexpectedly, one of Eric's former colleagues stood up. He apologized to Charles for not speaking out against the injustice when it happened. "You've taught us that silence is a choice too," he said. Charles nodded. "The important thing is that you're willing to change. That matters most." Meanwhile, Eric, watching the event unfold on his phone, realized the profound impact of his actions. Stricken with guilt, he wrote a letter to Charles, acknowledging his mistake and promising to change his attitude toward people. The evening ended on a warm note. Charles approached Linda and thanked her. "You gave me a chance to be heard. Thank you for your courage." The next morning, newspapers ran headlines like, "Veteran restores dignity to his legacy." Paradise Restaurant became a symbol of transformation, and Charles's story inspired thousands to stand against injustice and indifference. That day marked the start of a new chapter, not just for Charles and his restaurant, but for a society that witnessed how resilience and kindness could bring about meaningful change.